The Nexus station had been the crown jewel of galactic diplomacy for 3 centuries, a gleaming testament to civilized species working together in harmony. Well, mostly harmony. There was still the occasional incidents involving the Crystalline tendency to dissolve furniture with their acidic secretions, or the Vorthak habit of challenging random passers-by to death matches over parking spots. But these were considered minor cultural quirks compared to the galaxy's newest headache: humans. The Deathworlder classification system, designed by the ever-helpful Galactic Safety Commission, had categorized Earth as a Class 12 death world. Not because of its predators, mind you, though the Commission had spent considerable time debating whether creatures called honey badgers were actually demons in disguise. Not because of its weather patterns, despite the creative ways Earth managed to hurl frozen water from the sky. No, Earth earned its terrifying classification because its dominant species had somehow managed to thrive in what any reasonable being would consider a cosmic horror show. Gravity that could crush a Felinian's delicate bone structure. Humans jogged in it for fun. An atmosphere with enough oxygen to make a gaseous collective member literally explode. Humans complained when there wasn't enough of it. A day-night cycle that would drive most species into circadian madness. Humans had invented something called shift work and carried on as if this was perfectly normal. The inter-species university exchange program had seemed like such a good idea at the time. Cultural exchange, they said. Mutual understanding, they said. Nobody had mentioned that hosting Deathworlders would require updating insurance policies and installing emergency medical bays on every deck. Zex'thari Mollusk Prime certainly hadn't signed up for this indignity. The heir to the Crystalline Commerce Consortium stood 7 feet tall, his translucent body refracting the station's artificial sunlight into prismatic rainbows that danced across his perfectly sculpted features. Crystallines were the galaxy's undisputed champions of sophistication. Their bodies were living art, their minds sharp enough to cut through quantum mathematics like warm butter, and their patience legendary. Well, legendary right up until they encountered primitive mammals who chewed with their mouths open and somehow managed to break things just by existing near them. It's not natural, Zex'thari explained to his circle of admirers as they gathered in the station's most exclusive lounge, a place where the artificial gravity was set to a comfortable 0.3 G and the ambient temperature maintained at a civilized 15 degrees Celsius. These creatures stumble around in crushing gravity, breathing poison, eating dead animals, and somehow they are allowed to walk among us like equals. His audience, a mix of Felinians with their graceful feline features, several ethereal collective members whose gaseous forms shimmered in containment suits, and a few aquatic Federation representatives in their mobility tanks, murmured agreement. They'd all had encounters with the human exchange students. The creatures were walking disasters. I heard one of them sneezed and shattered a window on Deck 7, whispered Crystalline, her Felinian ears twitching with delicious gossip. That's nothing, added Vexmore from his containment suit, the gas within shifting colors as he spoke. One of them tried to pet me yesterday. Pet me. As if I was some domestic creature. Zex'thari's crystalline form darkened slightly, the crystalline equivalent of a disapproving frown. They need to learn their place in civilized society. Perhaps a demonstration of proper hierarchy would benefit everyone. And that's when Chen walked into the lounge. Kai stood barely 5.5 feet tall, which made her practically microscopic by galactic standards. Her black hair was pulled back in what humans called a practical ponytail, and she wore the standard exchange student uniform that somehow managed to look simultaneously too small and too large on her compact frame. She moved with the unconscious grace of someone who'd grown up scrambling over asteroid mining equipment, dodging cave-ins, and fixing broken machinery in zero gravity. The lounge fell silent as she approached the beverage station. Every conversation stopped. Every eye tracked her movements as if she were a predator stalking through a herd of prey animals. Which, from a certain perspective, wasn't entirely inaccurate. Humans had this unnerving habit of moving like they owned whatever space they occupied, regardless of whether they were the smallest, weakest, or most outnumbered beings in the room. It was profoundly unsettling to species who had spent millennia perfecting the art of civilized deference. Kai seemed oblivious to the attention as she ordered something called coffee, a beverage that most species considered a controlled substance due to its tendency to make humans even more unpredictable than usual. She was reviewing notes on her datapad, probably cramming for her comparative xenobiology exam, when Zex'thari decided to provide that educational demonstration he'd been contemplating. "Excuse me, primitive," he said, his voice carrying the perfect crystalline resonance that made even seasoned diplomats feel inadequate. "I believe you're in the wrong section of the station." Kai looked up from her datapad with the expression of someone who'd heard this particular song before. "I'm sorry, what?" "This lounge is for civilized beings," Zex'thari continued, rising to his full imposing height. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in the cargo bay, with the other freight." The silence that followed could have been weaponized. Several Felinians actually took a step back, their survival instincts screaming warnings about cornered predators. The ethereal collective members' gases swirled nervously in their containment suits. Kai, however, simply nodded thoughtfully. "I see. And you are?" Zex'thari Molus Prime, heir to the Crystalline Commerce Consortium and representative of a species that mastered faster-than-light travel when your ancestors were still figuring out fire. "Impressive," Kai said in the tone of someone who was definitely not impressed. "I'm Kai Chen, exchange student from Sol System, and representative of a species that figured out how to survive on a planet that actively tries to kill everything living on it. But sure, let's compare resumes." If Zex'thari had possessed anything resembling mammalian blood vessels, they would have been throbbing visibly. Instead, his crystalline structure shifted through several angry shades of deep purple. "You dare to speak to me as an equal?" "Actually, I was speaking to you as someone trying to study for an exam in peace," Kai replied, taking a sip of her coffee. "But if you want to make this about species hierarchy, we can do that too." The gravitational physics lab incident happened 3 days later. Professor Ythara's advanced gravitational theory class was considered one of the university's most challenging courses. The lab sessions required students to work with actual gravitational field generators, devices that could create localized pockets of altered spacetime for experimental purposes. Safety protocols were extensive, supervision was constant, and accidents were supposedly impossible. Supposedly. Kai was working alone at her assigned station, carefully calibrating a field generator to create a 2G pocket for her research on human bone density adaptation. It was delicate work that required absolute precision. One wrong calculation could create a gravitational anomaly that would turn everything within a 3-meter radius into very flat pancakes. Zex'thari approached during a lull in supervision, his crystalline form refracting the lab's harsh lighting into dazzling patterns. "Having trouble with civilized technology, primitive?" "It's actually pretty straightforward once you understand the underlying mathematics," Kai replied without looking up from her calculations. "Though I suppose different species have different learning curves." "Indeed they do." Zex'thari leaned closer, his massive form casting shadows across her workstation. "Perhaps you'd benefit from a more hands-on learning experience." What happened next would be debated in academic circles for years afterward. According to Zex'thari, it was clearly an accident. He'd simply been reaching for an adjustment tool when his arm accidentally made contact with Kai's limb. According to the security footage, reviewed later by investigators, Zex'thari had deliberately grabbed Kai's forearm and applied pressure that would have been excessive even by crystalline standards. According to the medical scanner readings, Kai's radius bone snapped cleanly in 2 places. The sound was remarkably similar to a twig breaking, which seemed somehow inappropriate for something happening to a living being. Kai's sharp intake of breath was the only sound she made as her forearm bent at an angle that definitely wasn't supposed to exist in human anatomy. "Oh dear," Zex'thari said with the kind of synthetic concern that wouldn't have fooled a particularly gullible rock. "How clumsy of me. I suppose Deathworlder bones aren't as sturdy as I'd been led to believe." The other students in the lab, a mix of species who'd been pretending not to watch the confrontation, now stared in genuine shock. Violence was rare in civilized society, and casual violence was practically unthinkable. The fact that it had been committed against a Deathworlder made it simultaneously more horrifying and somehow more acceptable. Humans were dangerous, after all. Perhaps this would serve as a valuable lesson about knowing one's place. Kai looked down at her mangled arm with the clinical detachment of someone who'd grown up in an environment where injury was just another engineering problem to solve. "Well," she said calmly, "that's inconvenient." Station security arrived within minutes, followed closely by medical personnel who approached Kai like she might detonate at any moment. The lead investigator, a professional Aquatic Federation officer named Glubmore, took statements from all witnesses while the medical team worked to stabilize Kai's arm. Clearly an accident, Zex'thari explained with the wounded dignity of someone whose integrity had been questioned. I was merely trying to assist the primitive with her equipment when this unfortunate mishap occurred. The witnesses corroborated his story with the enthusiasm of people who really didn't want to get involved in interspecies politics. The security footage was somehow inconclusive due to a convenient angle that didn't quite capture the moment of contact. And after all, accidents happened, especially around humans, who were notorious for their fragility despite their Deathworlder classification. Dr. HFY, the Serpentine professor who ran the lab, personally escorted Kai to the medical bay while expressing sincere regret for the incident. The university would of course cover all medical expenses, and arrangements would be made for Kai to complete her coursework remotely while she recovered. These things happen, Dr. HFY said with the weary tone of someone who'd spent decades dealing with interspecies complications. Perhaps it would be best if you avoided unnecessarily challenging situations while you're healing. Kai nodded agreeably while the medical scanner mapped the fractures in her arm. The Nexus Station Medical Bay was equipped to handle virtually any biological emergency and human anatomy, while Primitive was well documented. The automated surgical unit could have her arm rebuilt and functional within hours. Actually, Kai said as the medical technician prepared the bone regeneration matrix, could you set this to heal naturally? Human physiology handles fractures better when we let the bone rebuild itself. The Vorthak medic, whose species regenerated lost limbs as a matter of course, found this request baffling. Natural healing would take weeks. The pain alone would be excruciating for a primitive nervous system. I'll manage, Kai assured him, accepting the temporary cost and pain medication with the sort of smile that made seasoned medical professionals nervous. She spent the next 36 hours in her quarters, officially recovering from her injury. Unofficially, she was conducting the most thorough research project of her academic career. The university's database contained comprehensive biological profiles for every known sapient species, including detailed anatomical charts, physiological specifications, and, most importantly, structural vulnerabilities. Kai cross-referenced this information with gravitational field data, materials science databases, and something called the Interspecies Combat Analysis Archives that probably shouldn't have been accessible to exchange students. Crystallines, she learned, were fascinating creatures. Their silicon-based biology created structures of incredible beauty and impressive durability under normal circumstances. They could withstand temperature extremes that would kill most carbon-based life forms. Their crystalline matrices could repair minor damage automatically, and their neural networks operated at frequencies that made them naturally gifted mathematicians and engineers. They also had one tiny, almost insignificant weakness that most species would never think to exploit: harmonic resonance frequency. Like all crystalline structures, crystalline physiology had a specific frequency at which their molecular bonds became unstable. It was a narrow range, precisely calculated, and required exact conditions to achieve. But under the right circumstances, with the right application of force at the right frequency, a crystalline structural integrity could be compromised in a matter of seconds. The artificial gravity gymnasium on Deck 15 was popular with species who needed to maintain their physiology in non-standard gravitational fields. Kai found Zex'thari there 2 days after the incident, working out in a 1.2 G field while his admirers watched from the observation deck. Her arm was still in its cast, but she'd modified the station's standard exercise clothing to accommodate the injury. She entered the gymnasium during the busy evening period when dozens of beings were pursuing various forms of physical fitness, and she timed her arrival to coincide with Zex'thari's usual routine. Well, Zex'thari announced loudly as she approached his workout area, "Look who's decided to venture out of her recovery nest. I trust your arm is healing properly, Primitive." "It's coming along nicely, thank you," Kai replied pleasantly. "I thought some light exercise might help with the recovery process." Exercise. Zex'thari's crystalline form shimmered with amusement. "I wasn't aware damaged freight was capable of physical activity." The gymnasium's background chatter quieted as other beings turned to watch this exchange. Word of the lab incident had spread throughout the station, and everyone knew that the human had been put in her place by the Crystalline heir. Seeing her appear publicly so soon after being disciplined was unexpected. "Oh, we humans are surprisingly resilient," Kai said, beginning what appeared to be simple stretching exercises. "It's one of the advantages of growing up on a death world. We learn to adapt." She moved through a series of warm-up routines, her movements fluid despite the cast on her arm. Her exercises seemed random to most observers, a few jumping motions here, some rhythmic stepping there, occasional bursts of what looked like primitive dancing. Zex'thari continued his own workout routine, which involved manipulating gravitational fields to create resistance training for his crystalline structure. It was an impressive display of both physical prowess and technological mastery, the sort of thing that reminded everyone present why crystallites were considered among the galaxy's elite species. That's when Kai began her final routine. Her movements suddenly became more focused, more purposeful. She was no longer exercising randomly. She was creating a specific pattern of motion, each step and jump and gesture calculated to generate precise vibrations through the gymnasium's deck plating. The first harmonic resonance began at 847.3 Hz. Zex'thari noticed the vibration as a subtle tremor in his crystalline structure, barely perceptible but oddly uncomfortable. He paused in his routine, looking around for the source of the disturbance. Kai continued her exercise, her movements building in intensity and precision. She was creating a complex interference pattern in the gymnasium's structural harmonics, using her knowledge of the station's construction materials and the gravitational field generators to amplify specific frequencies. The second harmonic kicked in at 1693.7 Hz. Now Zex'thari could feel it clearly, a discordant vibration that seemed to resonate through his entire crystalline matrix. It was deeply unpleasant, like fingernails on a chalkboard, but experienced through his entire body. Several other crystallites in the gymnasium were also beginning to look uncomfortable. "What are you doing, primitive?" Zex'thari demanded, his voice carrying harmonics of irritation and the first hints of genuine concern. "Just some basic Deathworlder calisthenics," Kai replied, her breathing controlled despite the increasing intensity of her movements. "We call it interval training." The third harmonic resonance achieved perfect alignment at 2541.1 Hz. Zex'thari's crystalline structure began to visibly vibrate, creating prismatic light patterns that flashed erratically across the gymnasium walls. The sensation was beyond uncomfortable now. It was actively painful, like having his molecular bonds systematically stressed to their breaking point. Which, in fact, was exactly what was happening. "Stop," he commanded, his voice cracking slightly as the resonance interfered with his vocal harmonics. "Stop this immediately." "Stop what?" Kai asked innocently, transitioning into what appeared to be an even more energetic phase of her routine. "I'm just exercising. Surely a sophisticated being like yourself can tolerate a little primitive physical activity." The fourth harmonic frequency locked in at 3388.4 Hz, and Zex'thari's structural integrity began to fail in cascading waves. The process was both beautiful and terrifying to watch. Hairline fractures appeared throughout his crystalline matrix, spreading like lightning through his 7-foot frame. The prismatic light refractions became chaotic, creating dizzying patterns that hurt to look at directly. His perfectly sculpted features began to develop stress cracks that deepened with each passing second. "Please," Zex'thari gasped, his voice now barely recognizable through the harmonic distortion. "Please stop." Kai continued a routine for exactly 40 seconds total, then smoothly transitioned into a cool-down phase. The harmonic resonance faded, the vibration ceased, and the gymnasium returned to its normal acoustic environment. Zex'thari collapsed. His crystalline structure didn't shatter completely. Kai had been very careful about that. Instead, he crumpled in sections, like a building with a compromised foundation. His arms folded awkwardly, his legs buckled at impossible angles, and his torso developed a pronounced lean that suggested major structural damage throughout his matrix. He was still conscious, still alive, but his 7-foot frame had compacted to roughly 5.5 feet of very expensive broken crystal. The gymnasium fell completely silent except for the soft tinkling sounds of small crystalline fragments settling onto the deck plating. "Oh dear," Kai said with exactly the same tone of synthetic concern that Zex'thari had used 2 days earlier. How clumsy of me. I suppose civilized physiology isn't as sturdy as I'd been led to believe. Station security arrived within minutes, but this time they approached the scene with considerably more caution. The lead investigator found himself dealing with a situation that didn't fit any of his standard protocols. A human had somehow managed to incapacitate a being 3 times her mass without laying a finger on him. What exactly happened here? Glubmore asked, his aquatic suit speakers struggling to convey his confusion. Exercise accident, Kai explained helpfully. I was doing some Deathworlder fitness routines when poor Zex'thari apparently suffered some kind of structural failure. I had no idea that civilized physiology was so sensitive to basic physical activity. The witness statements were remarkably consistent. Multiple beings confirmed that the human had been engaged in primitive physical exercise, while Zex'thari pursued his own workout routine. Nobody had seen any direct contact between them. The failure of Zex'thari's crystalline structure appeared to be spontaneous and inexplicable. The security footage was, once again, inconclusive. The gymnasium's acoustic dampeners had filtered out most of the relevant frequency data, and the visual record showed only a human exercising vigorously, while a crystalline suddenly developed structural problems. Dr. Zex'thari arrived at the medical bay just as the emergency surgical team was attempting to reconstruct Zex'thari's damaged matrix. The process would take weeks and cost more than most species' annual salaries, but crystalline physiology could eventually repair even severe structural damage. These things happen, Dr. Zex'thari said to Kai as they watched the medical team work. Perhaps it would be best if Mr. Molus Prime avoided unnecessarily challenging situations while he's healing. Kai nodded thoughtfully. I'll be sure to mention that when he's feeling better. We humans are always happy to share what we've learned about recovery from traumatic injuries. The political repercussions were immediate and extensive. The Crystalline Commerce Consortium demanded a full investigation, formal apologies, and financial compensation for the assault on their heir. The Nexus Station administration found itself trying to explain how a primitive Deathworlder had somehow managed to systematically destroy a crystalline structural integrity without actually touching him. The breakthrough came when Dr. Zex'thari requisitioned the gymnasium's complete acoustic analysis data from the engineering department. Buried in terabytes of routine environmental monitoring information, she found the harmonic frequency patterns that corresponded exactly with Kai's exercise routine. Ingenious, she murmured as she reviewed the data. Absolutely ingenious. The confrontation in the administrative offices 3 days later included representatives from a dozen species, 2 diplomatic corps, and enough legal documentation to construct a small space station. The evidence is clear, declared Ambassador Zex'thari of the Crystalline Consortium, her own pristine structure reflecting the harsh lighting like an angry prism. This primitive deliberately assaulted our heir using some form of sonic weapon. Actually, Dr. Zex'thari interrupted. The evidence shows that Ms. Chen was engaged in standard human exercise protocols. The harmonic frequencies generated by a physical activity just happened to coincide with certain structural vulnerabilities in crystalline physiology. Coincide. Ambassador Zex'thari's voice rose to painful levels. The frequency alignment was precise to 3 decimal places. This was clearly premeditated. Was it? Kai asked mildly from her seat at the conference table. Because I was under the impression that civilized species were supposed to be superior to primitives like myself. Are you saying that I somehow outcalculated a being whose species mastered faster than light travel when my ancestors were still figuring out fire? The silence that followed was the kind that made Korea diplomats very nervous. Furthermore, Kai continued, consulting her datapad. According to the university's medical records, Mr. Molus Prime suffered what the report describes as cascading structural failure due to harmonic resonance. I'm not a crystalline engineer, but that sounds like a design flaw rather than assault. Ambassador Zex'thari's form darkened to deep purple, the crystalline equivalent of apoplectic rage. You dare suggest that our physiology is flawed? Not flawed, Kai corrected. Just optimized for different environmental conditions. Crystalline biology is clearly designed for stable, predictable environments where harmful frequencies are carefully controlled. It's a perfectly reasonable evolutionary adaptation for a civilized species. She paused to take a sip of her coffee, apparently oblivious to the mounting tension in the room. The problem is that humans evolved in an environment where everything was constantly trying to kill us, so we developed this nasty habit of weaponizing whatever's available when we feel threatened. It's not malicious, it's just survival instinct. Survival instinct. Ambassador Zex'thari practically vibrated with indignation. Well, yes. When a being 3 times my size breaks my arm and threatens me publicly, my primitive Deathworlder brain automatically starts looking for ways to neutralize the threat. It's not sophisticated or civilized, but it's very effective. Dr. Zex'thari cleared her throat diplomatically. If I may interject, the medical scans of Ms. Chen's arm clearly show deliberate fractures consistent with external pressure applied by a crystalline appendage. The pattern matches perfectly with Mr. Mollusprime's Prime's hand structure. The ambassador's crystalline form shifted through several uncomfortable colors. That was clearly accidental. Of course, Kai agreed pleasantly. Just like my exercise routine was clearly accidental. Although I have to admit, it's interesting that my accidental response was so much more comprehensive than his accidental assault. She pulled up a holographic display showing comparative injury assessments. His accidental action resulted in 2 clean fractures that will heal completely in 4 to 6 weeks. My accidental response resulted in systemic structural damage that will require months of reconstruction and may leave permanent weaknesses in his crystalline matrix. The room fell silent as the implication sank in. The thing is, Kai continued conversationally, I held back. A lot. If I hadn't been very careful about frequency modulation and duration, Mr. Mollusprime would currently be a pile of very expensive sand. But that would have been rude, and we humans try to be civilized when we're guests. Ambassador Zex'thari stared at the small human with something approaching horror. You held back. Of course. Humans are naturally over-engineered for survival, but we're also social creatures. We understand proportional response. He broke my arm, so I broke his structural integrity just enough to make a point. Fair's fair. The diplomatic session ended with a formal agreement that both incidents would be classified as regrettable accidents, with all parties agreeing to exercise greater caution in future interactions. The Crystalline Consortium quietly withdrew their demands for compensation, and Zex'thari was transferred to a medical facility in crystalline space for extended reconstruction therapy. 6 months later, the Galactic Safety Commission quietly updated the Deathworlder classification system. The new protocols included extensive warnings about human adaptability, creativity, and their disturbing tendency to weaponize physics when they felt threatened. Kai completed her exchange program with honors, specializing in comparative xenobiology with a focus on structural engineering applications. Her thesis, Harmonic Resonance Applications in Multispecies Conflict Resolution, became required reading at diplomatic academies throughout the galaxy. Zex'thari, when he finally recovered, developed what his therapist described as a healthy respect for interspecies diversity. He never again referred to humans as primitives, and he made substantial donations to several Deathworlder cultural exchange programs. Dr. Zex'thari added a new safety protocol to her gravitational physics lab. No species shall engage in intimidation, harassment, or assault of any other species, regardless of perceived physical or technological superiority. Violations will result in immediate expulsion and possible exposure to uncontrolled Deathworlder physics demonstrations. And throughout the galaxy, civilized species began to reconsider their assumptions about primitive mammals who had somehow managed to turn survival instinct into an art form. After all, it only took 40 seconds to completely restructure the social hierarchy of the most advanced space station in known space. The galaxy's little problem with humans hadn't been solved. It had just been properly classified. Turns out, when you evolve on a planet that's actively trying to kill everything living on it, you develop some interesting problem-solving skills. The civilized galaxy was slowly learning to appreciate just how interesting those skills could be.